Chip, I'll pose that question directly to you. When it comes to extremism in this country, are we in a better position these days than we once were?
Well, you can have aberrant views without being someone who's going to take part in a terrorist attack. So if you take the metrics of are we at more of a threat from terrorism, the answer is probably no. That's a different question if you say, is community cohesion as great as it was? And the answer to that is probably no as well. So both those things can be true at the same time. But the metrics of terrorism coming out from Lee Rigby, for example, would probably tell you that we're in a better position than we were then, because partly geopolitical events worldwide have conspired against the terrorists. That's the fall of ISIS, the decapitation of Al-Qaeda, all those sorts of things, along with, if you look at the metrics of the number of arrests now, they're down significantly from what they were sort of 5 years ago. The length of sentences for those who were arrested for terrorism offences, most of them are for under 4 years. They're to do with dissemination of terrorist publications. But at the same time, there are worrying statistics as well. So the number of investigations remains pretty constant, somewhere between 600 and 800 investigations. That doesn't mean they'll all go into plots and into terrorist attacks. The number of attacks is down. The number of plots, because the benchmark is taken from March 17, which was the Westminster attack, is 37 plots since then. So over the last 6-year period, that's 37 plots which would have gone into executive terrorist action if there hadn't been external intervention by counter-terrorist police, MI5 together.
And what do you think about, for example, criticism of things like Prevent? We see countless reviews into that, a lot of criticism coming its way. Where do you stand on it?
Prevent is a good thing. Prevent is always going to be criticised by those who oppose it, particularly those who are of an ideological extremist nature, most particularly on the Islamist side, because they see it being against them, and they'd like to see all terrorist legislation rescinded because that would further their strategic cause. So the fact of safeguarding vulnerable people at a young age, because there is a young cohort to this, is something that should be applauded. You don't hear about the successes because there are safeguarding issues which are confidential, but Prevent does a very good job, and it needs to be supported. And we had the Shawcross review recently. It's also not true that there's a causal link between those who are referred to Prevent and the Channel programme and a linear progression towards being a terrorist. That simply is not true. They're separate processes and procedures which happen if you're on various pathways. So just because you are on Prevent does not mean you're going to become a terrorist in 5 or 10 years' time.
Interesting stuff. Chip Chapman, thank you very much for your insight there. Joe Phillips, what do you make of some of this?
Well, I think it's interesting what he just said, that we don't hear about the successes. And, of course, do we feel safer? Would we feel safer if we knew how many plots had been thwarted? I mean, Chip said 37 since 2017, but that's probably a small number compared to other things where there's been more intervention. I mean, if you think back to, and many of the viewers and listeners will remember what it was like when we, on mainland UK, mainland Britain, were living under the constant threat and worry of an IRA terror attack. And, of course, we've had terrible things. You mentioned the arena bombing, Michelle. We've had the London Bridge, Westminster Bridge, Borough Market, Liverpool Women's Hospital, the Dover Migrant Centre. And, of course, we've had the murder of 2 MPs in their constituencies, Joe Cox and David Amess. So it hasn't gone away. But I think what is interesting is probably the wrong word, but there seem to be more lone wolves, if you like. That makes them sound, romantic and good, which is not what I mean to say. But I think there are more people working alone, certainly in those cases, some of those cases I've mentioned, than organised terrorism. But I think, it's very difficult. How do you make the public feel safe while at the same time ask people to be aware and report something that's untoward or suspicions they've got?
Yeah, and if there was like a mass event, like a mass gathering or something, would that cross your mind in terms of attending huge,
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we all thought about it, of the coronation, the Queen's funeral last year. any big events like that, even the Eurovision Song Contest in Liverpool, or football matches, you know, the FA Cup final. All of those things are in an inherent risk. But, you know, as we know from those incidents, people just walking over Westminster Bridge, people walking over London Bridge, you know, stabbed or mown down. There's no rhyme or reason. I mean, I think, you know, what Chip Chapman was saying, that the security forces, security services and the police have got much better tools now. And I think probably, you know, internet, social media, that sort of stuff is probably a much better guidance.
Yeah, and I do think also as well there is a need for honesty, you know, when we're talking about prevent and things like that. And I think sometimes people are so afraid when it comes to political correctness and all the rest of it, because the Shawcross review, one of the things that I found quite interesting was it saying that the facts, and I'm reading directly because I don't want to be in trouble for misquoting, of course, the facts clearly demonstrate the most lethal threat in the last 20 years has come from Islamism, and that threat continues. Then it goes on to say prevent must address all extremist ideologies proportionately according to the threat each represents. However, Shawcross is saying his research shows that the present boundaries around what is termed by prevent as an extremist Islamist ideology are drawn too narrowly, while the boundaries around the ideology of the extreme right wing are too broad. It does not allow prevent to reflect accurately and deal effectively with the lethal risks that we actually face. I found that quite interesting. Alan Miller, your thoughts?
I think that obviously it's important that diligence and behind-the-scenes investigations continue, and that's important work. I am concerned that we've got a mixture of things that has happened. So on the one hand, we haven't addressed the hearts and minds, the values, the virtues of what's so great about Britain historically. Much of the kind of denigrating, the hatred, this kind of self-hatred that I think was actually reflected back towards us with the nihilistic terror attacks that wanted to attack anything that was about our way of life, almost like a reflection of our own disgust with ourselves. We've done nothing but rape and pillage. There's nothing great about history. The nation-state is often mocked, and the victories of history are often presented in this whole litany of terrible scourges that we've done, and it gets reflected. And I think we haven't addressed that issue in terms of hearts and minds and ideas and what's great about things. So there's still a potential for some of those things to be there. In fact, we flatter them too much. I also think something else has happened that's very interesting and concerning, because the commentator was talking about cohesion in society, and what we've seen much more is an extremism of a refusal to allow civic engagement. You can't say that. People saying that actually if Nazis come out we can kill them, and they're comparing people who talk about sex-based rights, talking about gender, as being Nazis and fascists. So if they say that a woman is a woman and a man is a man, you can't... You have to be very specific and clear about that. Say that's a Nazi or you're far right. We've seen comments like that, not just in America, but here we've seen women being attacked at protests, not just in New Zealand, but here. And Speaker's Corner, we've seen a reluctance to engage in that type of thing. Extremism where people will throw things at you. They'll say you should have things done to you if you say certain things around issues. And not just on the campus, but in everyday life. But equally, I'm concerned that there's an overstretching of the state in all these things. So I don't think it's right that the state attempts to limit what we say. I think we have to be able to say if there's an issue in a certain community or a group, that we can have those discussions openly and scrutinise them, that we allow people to be offended and insulted, actually, with freedom depends upon it, and that we don't start calling people who are extreme with their ideas politically as terrorists necessarily. You might have a radical idea about reorganising the economy or about providing it's peaceful and it's legal and free. Because we've seen in America where the discussion about Antifa, where they're saying, well, perhaps we should make them a terror group because they've attacked people. You've got laws already that exist for that kind of thing. So I think we need a proportionate discussion, but I am very concerned about the fact that the extremism that's becoming a bit more prevalent in society, you can't say things and you actually use violence to shut people down you don't agree with.
Yeah, and a lot of people, by the way, when it comes to things like, you know, just stop oil and all the rest of it, a lot of people will get in touch with me and say, these guys should be categorised as eco-terrorists. And a lot of people will use the definition of terrorism and apply it to some of their behaviours and say, well, how about including that group and campaign and all the rest of it within the terrorism definition? So, I don't know, sometimes it feels like not enough people are perhaps being described as terrorists that should be. And then the boundaries on the other side are getting quite wide in terms of who other people want to put into that bucket. You tell me your thoughts on that.
Well, I think what Alan says is absolutely right, that the language that people use from across the political spectrum can be vile, can be offensive, can be threatening, and can be downright frightening. But at the same time, and I agree with Alan, you know, you don't want to take up, you know, desperately short resources of going to the police, or should you go to police and say, oh, somebody said something nasty about me on Twitter? It's about striking the balance, and a lot of it, I think, is about how we educate and engage with young people. So Alan and I were just talking outside, Michelle, about, in fact, about the sort of stop oil and that sort of stuff. And it's about engagement. And what we were saying is that, actually, if you want people to come around to your way of thinking, you need to engage with them, not to say you're either with me or against me. And that seems to be the polarisation. It's so black or white, for or against. You're a Nazi, you're not, you're a terrorist. And we need to look at the language, I think, that we use.
And I do get what you're saying, and I think particularly in things like, you know, the gender stuff, yeah, you know, polarisation, we can bring people with us, but the harsh reality is in this society there are people who literally hate our way of life. They do not like what we stand for. They want to do everything possible to undermine what we stand for, and they will stop at nothing, in some cases, as we very sadly experience, you know, trying to kill people, trying to amend, modify, restrict our way of living because they do not like it. And unfortunately, a lot of those people, they value dying in the same way as many of us value living. And I think when you come to those people, having a nice rational conversation and all the rest of it and trying to find points of agreement, I think people are way too far gone for that. But what do you make to it all? Get in touch. GB Views at gbnews.uk is how you can reach